Welcome to the Midnight Narrator, where the lights go out, the stories get darker, and the truth is never quite what it seems. If you're here for true crime, creepy stories, and the kind of stories that linger long after the screen goes black, hit that subscribe button. Now let's begin. The Moscow, Idaho murders, a complete timeline of the case. Part 1, the night everything changed. It was the early morning hours of November 13, 2022, in Moscow, Idaho. Moscow is a small college town in northern Idaho, home to the University of Idaho. It is the kind of place where students, professors, and longtime residents live alongside one another, and where a late night out with friends can seem completely ordinary. But on this particular Sunday morning, something happened inside a 6-bedroom rental house just south of the University of Idaho campus that would transform the community and capture worldwide attention. 4 University of Idaho students were murdered inside the home. Their names were Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. Madison Mogen was 21 years old. Kaylee Goncalves was 21. Xana Kernodle was 20. Ethan Chapin was 20. They were not simply names in a criminal investigation. They were college students with families, friends, relationships, ambitions, and plans for the future. And for months after their deaths, one of the biggest questions in America was simple. Who killed them? For investigators, the case would become an enormous race against time. For the families, it would become the defining tragedy of their lives. And for the public, it would become one of the most intensely scrutinized murder investigations of the decade. Eventually, investigators would identify a suspect. His name was Bryan Kohberger. But before Kohberger was arrested, before prosecutors presented their evidence, and before the case reached a courtroom, there was a house in Moscow, 4 victims, 2 surviving roommates, and a crime scene that initially seemed almost impossible to understand. This is the story of what happened. Part 2, the 4 students. To understand the case, it is important to start with the 4 people whose lives were taken. Madison Mogen was a senior at the University of Idaho. Friends described her as outgoing, energetic, and deeply connected to the people around her. She was studying marketing and was particularly close with Kaylee Goncalves. Kaylee was also 21. She was preparing to graduate and had already accepted a job in Austin, Texas. She had been planning for a future beyond Moscow. Madison and Kaylee had been close friends for years. They were often together, and that friendship would become important to the events of November 12 and 13. Xana Kernodle was 20 years old. She was a junior at the University of Idaho studying marketing. Xana was in a relationship with Ethan Chapin. Ethan was also 20. He was a University of Idaho student and athlete who was dating Xana. He was a member of the Sigma Chi fraternity and was known for his outgoing personality. On the night of November 12, Ethan and Xana were together. Kaylee and Madison were together as well. None of them knew that they were approaching the final hours of their lives. Part 3, November 12, 2022. Saturday, November 12, began like an ordinary weekend for college students. Kaylee and Madison spent part of the evening together. They eventually went to a bar in downtown Moscow called the Corner Club. Surveillance footage later established that the 2 women were there that night. They left the bar sometime after 1:00 in the morning. Meanwhile, Xana and Ethan were attending a party at the Sigma Chi house. The 2 couples would eventually make their way back to the King Road residence. The house was home to 6 people. 4 of them were eventually killed. 2 others, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, were also living there. Those 2 surviving roommates would become crucial to understanding the timeline. At approximately 1:56 a.m., Kaylee and Madison were captured by a food truck livestream in downtown Moscow. The footage showed them ordering food. They appeared normal. They were laughing and talking. There was no indication that anything was about to happen. After getting their food, they returned to the house. Their movements that night would later become part of a painstaking reconstruction by investigators. Meanwhile, Xana and Ethan eventually returned from the Sigma Chi house. By approximately 1:45 a.m., the 4 victims were believed to have been inside the King Road residence. And then, sometime in the early morning hours, something happened. Part 4: The House on King Road. The residence at 1122 King Road was unusual. It was a large, multi-level house located in a neighborhood surrounded by other student residences. The house had multiple bedrooms and entrances. The victims occupied different rooms. Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk were also inside. At some point during the early morning hours, an intruder entered the house. According to the evidence later presented by prosecutors, that intruder was Bryan Kohberger. The prosecution's case established that 4 people were stabbed to death. The exact sequence of the killings was reconstructed through forensic evidence, witness statements, digital evidence, surveillance footage, and other investigative work. But for the public, one of the most haunting aspects of the case was what the surviving roommates experienced that night. Dylan Mortensen later described waking up because she believed one of her roommates was crying. She also heard what she described as playing with a dog. At one point, she opened her bedroom door. She saw a man walking through the house. According to her later account, the man walked past her. She described him as being approximately 5 feet 10 inches or taller, not very muscular, with bushy eyebrows. He was wearing dark clothing and a mask that covered his mouth and nose. Dylan did not immediately understand what she had witnessed. The man walked out of the house. The door closed, and then he was gone. Part 5: The 911 call. The surviving roommates remained inside the house. For reasons that became the subject of intense public speculation, emergency services were not called immediately after the intruder left. At approximately 11:58 a.m. on November 13, a 911 call was made from the residence. The caller reported that one of the roommates was unconscious and that they needed help. The exact circumstances surrounding the call generated enormous public interest. Some early reports described confusion about whether someone had passed out or whether there was another emergency. But when police arrived, they discovered something far more horrifying. 4 people were dead. The victims were identified as Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. The crime scene was immediately secured. The investigation had begun. Part 6: Moscow goes into shock. The murders shocked Moscow. The University of Idaho community was devastated. But there was another problem. Nobody knew who had done it. And nobody knew whether the killer was still nearby. For students living in Moscow, the uncertainty was terrifying. The university cancelled classes. Some students left town. Others stayed with friends or family. Rumors spread rapidly online. Social media became filled with theories. People began analyzing everything they could find about the victims, their friends, their relationships, the house, the police investigation, and potential suspects. Some theories were wildly speculative. Others were completely false. Investigators repeatedly asked the public not to interfere with the investigation or spread misinformation. Meanwhile, police were dealing with a massive crime scene. More than one person had been killed. There were no obvious answers. And the killer appeared to have disappeared. Part 7: The investigation begins. Investigators began processing the house. The FBI, Idaho State Police, Moscow Police Department, and other agencies became involved. Thousands of pieces of information would eventually be collected. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage. They examined cell phone records. They interviewed witnesses. They collected DNA. They searched for vehicles. They reconstructed movements. They looked for anything that could identify the person who entered the house. One particular piece of evidence would eventually become one of the most important clues in the entire case. A knife sheath. Investigators found a sheath near one of the victims. The sheath appeared to be associated with a ka-ba-style knife. But the knife itself was missing. More importantly, investigators discovered DNA on the sheath. The DNA would eventually become central to the case against Bryan Kohberger. But at the time, investigators did not know whose DNA it was. Part 8: The white Hyundai Elantra. Another major clue came from surveillance video. Investigators were looking for vehicles that had been near the house around the time of the murders. They identified a white Hyundai Elantra. The vehicle appeared repeatedly in surveillance footage around the area. Investigators eventually began searching for the vehicle and its owner. That search became increasingly focused on a white Hyundai Elantra associated with Bryan Kohberger. Kohberger was a graduate student at nearby Washington State University in Pullman, Washington. Pullman is only about 7 miles from Moscow. He was studying criminal justice and criminology. That fact would later receive enormous attention. At the time of the murders, Kohberger was approximately 28 years old. He had moved to the area to pursue his graduate studies. And investigators eventually discovered that he drove a white Hyundai Elantra. Part 9: The phone records. Investigators also examined cellular data. According to the evidence later described in court, Kohberger's phone had connected to cell towers in the Moscow area on multiple occasions before the murders. Some of those connections were relevant to the investigation because they suggested Kohberger had been in the area near the King Road residence. Investigators were building a picture. A white Hyundai Elantra. A suspect who lived nearby. Cell phone activity. And DNA associated with the crime scene. But investigators still needed to determine whether all of those pieces belonged to the same person. Part 10: The search for Bryan Kohberger. By December 2022, investigators had identified Bryan Kohberger as a person of interest. The investigation was becoming increasingly focused on him. But there was a complication. Kohberger had returned to Pennsylvania. He had driven across the country with his father. Investigators followed. Authorities monitored his movements. And eventually, law enforcement obtained a DNA sample connected to Kohberger's family. Investigators used genetic information to help connect the crime scene DNA to Kohberger. The investigation was now moving toward an arrest. Part 11: December 30, 2022. In the early morning hours of December 30, 2022, nearly 7 weeks after the murders, authorities in Pennsylvania arrested Bryan Kohberger. He was taken into custody at his family's home in Monroe County, Pennsylvania. The arrest sent shockwaves across the country. For the first time, the public had a name. Bryan Kohberger, a graduate student in criminology. A man who had been living only a short distance from Moscow. A man whose vehicle investigators had connected to the area. And according to prosecutors, a man whose DNA was connected to the knife sheath found at the crime scene. But an arrest is not a conviction. The case still had to be proven in court. Part 12: The affidavit. When Kohberger was arrested, investigators had already assembled a substantial amount of evidence. A probable cause affidavit later became public. It described the investigation in considerable detail. According to the affidavit, investigators identified Kohberger's white Hyundai Elantra in surveillance footage. They also analyzed cell phone data. And most importantly, investigators said DNA recovered from the knife sheath was consistent with Kohberger's DNA. The affidavit also described a series of movements allegedly made by Kohberger around the time of the murders. According to investigators, his phone stopped connecting to the cellular network around the time the killings occurred. Later, the phone reappeared on the network. The evidence suggested that Kohberger had traveled to the area of the King Road house. Investigators also said the phone was later detected in Pullman. The prosecution would eventually argue that these pieces of evidence formed a coherent picture. Part 13, the question of motive. One question remained unanswered. Why? Why would someone murder 4 college students? Why those 4 people? Why that house? Why that night? For years, the public searched for answers. Was there a connection between Kohberger and the victims? Had he met them? Had he followed them? Was the crime planned? Was it spontaneous? Was there a personal motive? Was there a psychological motive? The investigation generated countless theories, but none provided a definitive answer. And even after Kohberger eventually pleaded guilty, no clear motive was publicly established. That remains one of the most frustrating aspects of the case. There is a difference between knowing who committed a crime and understanding why they committed it. In this case, the first question was answered. The second largely was not. Part 14, the Internet takes over. The Moscow murders became one of the biggest true crime stories in the world. Social media platforms were flooded with theories. TikTok creators analyzed the case. YouTube channels produced hours of content. Online communities examined photographs, videos, police statements, surveillance footage, and court documents. Some people attempted to identify suspects before police had done so. Others accused innocent people. The families of the victims were repeatedly exposed to speculation about their loved ones. The case became an example of how modern true crime can spread almost instantaneously. Every detail could become a viral theory. Every unanswered question could become a conspiracy. And every new piece of information could be analyzed by millions of people within hours. For investigators, this created both opportunities and problems. Public tips could be useful, but misinformation could also overwhelm an investigation. Part 15, Kohberger's defense. After his arrest, Bryan Kohberger maintained his legal right to a defense. His attorneys challenged various aspects of the prosecution's case. They questioned evidence. They raised issues concerning the investigation. They filed motions seeking information and challenging the state's ability to prosecute the case. One of the biggest legal questions involved DNA. Another involved the state's theory of how the murders occurred. The defense also sought information about the surviving roommates and other evidence collected during the investigation. The case was moving toward what promised to be one of the most closely watched criminal trials in America. And then something unexpected happened. Part 16, the death penalty. Idaho prosecutors had sought the death penalty. That meant Kohberger potentially faced execution if convicted of the murders. The possibility of a death penalty trial added enormous stakes to the proceedings. A trial would likely have lasted weeks or potentially longer. Hundreds of witnesses could have been called. Forensic evidence would have been examined in detail. The surviving roommates could have been required to testify. Families would have had to sit through evidence describing the deaths of their children. The defense would have attacked the state's evidence. The prosecution would have presented its case. And the public would have heard far more details about the murders. But that trial never happened. Part 17, the guilty plea. In July 2025, Bryan Kohberger changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. The agreement meant that prosecutors would not pursue the death penalty. Instead, Kohberger would receive 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He would also receive a 10-year sentence for burglary. The plea was a stunning development. For more than 2 years, the public had expected a trial. Instead, Kohberger admitted responsibility in court. He acknowledged killing Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. The legal process that had captivated the country suddenly moved towards sentencing. Part 18, the sentencing. On July 23, 2025, Kohberger was sentenced. Judge Stephen Hippler imposed 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He also imposed an additional 10-year sentence for burglary. The courtroom was filled with the families and loved ones of the victims. They finally had an opportunity to speak directly to the man who had killed their children. The victim impact statements were emotional and often furious. Parents spoke about the futures their children would never have. Siblings spoke about losing brothers and sisters. Friends spoke about memories. And some spoke about forgiveness. The hearing became less about Bryan Kohberger and more about the 4 people whose lives had been taken. Kohberger ultimately declined to make a lengthy statement. The judge then sentenced him to spend the rest of his life in prison. The trial that many had expected would never happen. Part 19, What We Know. At this point, the broad outline of the case is clear. On November 13, 2022, 4 University of Idaho students were murdered in their off-campus home in Moscow. Investigators eventually identified Bryan Kohberger as the suspect. Evidence presented in the case included DNA, surveillance footage, vehicle information, and cellular data. Kohberger was arrested in Pennsylvania in December 2022. He initially pleaded not guilty. He later pleaded guilty in July 2025. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without parole, plus 10 years for burglary. Legally, the case appeared finished. But it wasn't quite over. Part 20, The Attempt to Withdraw the Plea. In July 2026, approximately 1 year after pleading guilty, Bryan Kohberger filed a petition seeking to withdraw his guilty plea. That filing dramatically reopened public discussion surrounding the case. Kohberger argued that his plea was not properly entered and alleged ineffective assistance by his attorneys. He claimed that he had been pressured into accepting the plea agreement and that his lawyers had not adequately handled certain evidence. He also raised questions about evidence that he claimed could have affected his decision to plead guilty. Among the claims was an argument concerning hair or other trace evidence associated with the crime scene. However, it is critical to distinguish between an allegation made in a legal filing and a finding that the allegation is true. Kohberger previously stood in court and entered a guilty plea. He had acknowledged responsibility for the killings. His current effort seeks to undo that plea. That does not mean that the conviction has automatically been overturned. It does not mean that he has been declared innocent. And it does not mean that a new trial has been granted. The court must determine whether his legal arguments satisfy the demanding requirements for withdrawing a guilty plea after sentencing. As of August 2026, that process remains unresolved. Part 21, The Evidence Against Kohberger. The evidence in this case is complicated, but several pieces became particularly important. The first is DNA. Investigators found male DNA on the knife sheath recovered at the crime scene. The state connected that DNA to Kohberger. The second major category is surveillance footage. Investigators identified a white Hyundai Elantra moving around the area during the relevant time period. Kohberger drove a white Hyundai Elantra. The third category is cellular evidence. Investigators reconstructed portions of Kohberger's movements using phone records and cell tower data. The fourth category involves the surviving roommate's observations. Dylan Mortensen reported seeing a masked man leaving the house during the early morning hours. And finally, there was the overall collection of evidence. No single piece existed in complete isolation. The prosecution's case relied on multiple pieces of evidence that investigators said pointed toward Kohberger. Kohberger ultimately admitted responsibility by pleading guilty. Part 22, The Surviving Roommates. The 2 surviving roommates became an important and controversial part of the story. Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk were inside the home when the murders occurred. Neither was physically attacked. Both were nevertheless left to live with the psychological consequences of what happened. Dylan's account of seeing the masked man became one of the most discussed elements of the case. But the public response to the surviving roommates was sometimes cruel. People online questioned their behavior. They questioned why they did not call police immediately. They questioned what they knew. They questioned what they heard. Those questions were amplified by social media. But hindsight is powerful. Being inside a house in the middle of the night, hearing unexplained noises, seeing a stranger walking through a dark hallway, and not understanding that multiple people have just been murdered is very different from knowing the complete situation after the fact. The surviving roommates were not responsible for the murders. They were survivors. Part 23, The Families. The people who ultimately paid the greatest price were the families. For the Goncalves family, Kaylee's death meant losing a daughter who was preparing to move into the next stage of her life. For the Mogen family, Madison's death meant losing a daughter and friend who had spent so much of her life connected to Kaylee. For the Kernodle family, Xana's death meant losing a daughter and sister who was still building her future. For the Chapin family, Ethan's death meant losing a son whose life was still unfolding. The families were forced to experience something no family should ever experience. They lost their loved ones. Then they had to watch the entire world discuss them. Their children became photographs on television. Their lives became evidence. Their deaths became headlines. And every court hearing reopened the wound. Part 24, Why this case became so famous. There are several reasons the Moscow murders became such a massive story. First, the victims were young college students. Second, the murders appeared to be random and inexplicable. Third, there were multiple victims. Fourth, 2 roommates survived. Fifth, the suspect was eventually revealed to be a criminology graduate student living nearby. And sixth, the investigation unfolded in the age of social media. The public had unprecedented access to information. But that access came with a price. The line between legitimate investigation and online speculation became increasingly blurred. The case became a massive online mystery. Millions of people tried to solve it. But solving a murder is not a game. There are real people behind the evidence, real families behind the photographs, and real consequences when innocent people are accused. Part 25, The Missing Motive. Even after Kohberger's guilty plea, one major question remains. Why? There has never been a definitive public explanation for why these 4 students were targeted. Kohberger's guilty plea established his legal responsibility. It did not provide the public with a satisfying explanation. And perhaps that is one of the most unsettling things about the case. Humans naturally want explanations. We want to understand what motivates someone to do something incomprehensible. We want there to be a reason. But sometimes the available evidence does not provide one. The families may never receive the explanation they deserve. And the public may never know what was happening inside Kohberger's mind. Part 26, The Case Today. As of August 2026, Bryan Kohberger remains imprisoned. He is serving 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, along with a 10-year sentence for burglary. But his legal team is attempting to challenge the guilty plea. Kohberger has argued that his plea should be withdrawn. The state will have an opportunity to respond. The court will ultimately determine whether his claims meet the legal standard necessary to reopen the case. For the families, the development has been painful. They believed the legal process had reached its conclusion in 2025. Now the possibility of additional litigation has reopened some of the emotions surrounding the murders. But regardless of what happens with the legal challenge, 4 people remain at the center of this story. Madison, Kaylee, Xana, Ethan. Part 27, Remembering the Victims. It is easy for a case like this to become centered around the person accused of committing the crime. Bryan Kohberger's name appears in headlines. His photographs circulate online. His legal filings become news. But that can cause something important to be forgotten. The victims had lives before they became victims. Madison Mogen was a daughter, sister, friend, and student. Kaylee Goncalves was a daughter, sister, friend, and young woman preparing for a new chapter. Xana Kernodle was a daughter, sister, friend, and student building a future. Ethan Chapin was a son, brother, friend, athlete, and student. Their lives were much larger than the circumstances of their deaths. And ultimately, that is how they deserve to be remembered. Not simply as 4 names in a murder case, but as 4 young people who had futures ahead of them. Part 28, The Questions That Remain. The Moscow murders have answers. But they also have unanswered questions. Why did the killer choose that house? Why those victims? Was there a specific motive? How long had the killer been watching the house? What exactly happened inside during those final minutes? What was the killer thinking? Why did the surviving roommates not immediately understand the full extent of what had happened? And now, perhaps the newest question. Will Bryan Kohberger's attempt to withdraw his guilty plea succeed? Those questions may continue to be debated. But there is an important distinction between what is known and what is speculation. We know 4 students were murdered. We know Kohberger pleaded guilty. We know he was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without parole. We know he is now attempting to challenge that guilty plea. Everything beyond the established evidence should be treated carefully. Part 29, The Legacy of Moscow. The murders changed Moscow. They changed the University of Idaho. They changed the families. They changed the lives of the surviving roommates. And they became a case study in modern criminal investigation. Technology played a major role. DNA helped investigators identify a suspect. Surveillance cameras helped reconstruct movements. Cellular data helped establish locations. Digital evidence helped investigators build timelines. And public records eventually allowed the world to see pieces of the investigation. But technology did not make the case less human. Behind every piece of evidence was a person. Behind every photograph was someone's child. Behind every court filing was another reminder that 4 lives had been lost. Part 30, The Final Chapter has not been written. The original investigation may have reached a major conclusion in 2025. Bryan Kohberger pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. For many people, that was supposed to be the end. But the legal system allows defendants to challenge convictions under certain circumstances. Kohberger has now chosen to do exactly that. Whether his challenge succeeds remains to be determined. What happens next will depend on the courts, the evidence, and the legal standards governing post-conviction relief. But regardless of what happens inside a courtroom, the central fact of this case will not change. On November 13, 2022, 4 young people lost their lives. Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin. They were students. They were friends. They were sons and daughters. They had plans. They had families waiting for them. They had futures. And those futures ended in a house in Moscow, Idaho. The investigation that followed would span years. It would involve local police, state investigators, the FBI, forensic specialists, attorneys, judges, and countless witnesses. It would generate millions of hours of online discussion. It would become one of the most closely watched true crime cases in modern American history. And even after a guilty plea, a sentence, and a life behind bars, questions remain. Perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of the Moscow murders. A criminal investigation can tell us who committed a crime. A courtroom can establish guilt. A sentence can establish punishment. But sometimes, even after all of that, there are questions that may never be answered. Why? Why these four? Why that night? And what happened in the mind of the person who decided to take 4 lives? Those questions may never have complete answers. But the 4 people at the center of this story deserve to remain more than a mystery. They deserve to be remembered for who they were. Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin. 4 lives, 4 families, 4 futures that were stolen, and a case that continues to leave an entire community asking questions years after that November night in Moscow, Idaho.